Preparing this talk, it was actually just a real brain game, and it was so much fun just to go through and look at all of the different activities that the lab has done in the past few years. And then the challenge kind of hit me, how are we going to put this into a half-hour talk? Anyway, what we'll do today is we'll do our best, and we'll showcase our Arctic research. It'll only be a showcase from a couple of grants that we've actually worked on, and only a few papers out of all the ones that we've done. Okay, but let me introduce you to what I think is an amazing team in the lab. Currently we have 3 postdocs in the lab, spread between remote sensing, working on the dryland fluxes, thanks to Jar's work there. And Sandra Villarreal stayed on after her PhD, and she's working on an ecoinformatics project in the lab as well. Our doctoral students are also, our full-time technicians in the lab are a bunch of really, really fun guys, as you can see. Steve often has trouble keeping his tongue in his mouth there. But these guys are really, I lean on them so much, and I'm so grateful for everything they do to basically keep things ticking over. So Ryan has been in the lab for many years now, and he's really our mainstay for anything related to GIS, sysadmin. A lot of the field work really relies heavily on his shoulders. And Stephen has come on recently to help him with some of the GIS work in particular. But Ari really takes the lead on a lot of our programming, and thanks to Hazuri, we have some pretty amazing hardware that we're able to develop ourselves and also get working in some pretty tough environments at times. Okay? Our doctoral students, you'll see some of these guys are also technicians in the lab. So Hazuri just started in the environmental science engineering program. Ari's doing his doctorate in the computer science department as well. And Sergio is well underway, hopefully finishing early next semester in environmental science engineering as well. Oops, as I mentioned, we had some technical problems. And our master's students, similarly Stephen and Ryan, full-time techs in the lab, are doing their master's part-time in the lab. And Naomi's working out on the Hornada experimental range. And Ramon's been working on our most recent drone project. We've had many undergraduates in the lab recently. These are just some of the fun guys here working in the summer. It's Ezekiel and Marcella working up in the Arctic this summer. But what we love to do in our lab is sort of meld several different disciplines all together. But really, our sort of focus here is advancing environmental science. And we work in 3 primary locations doing that type of work. That's in the Arctic, in the drylands. We've got a large site out on the USDA Hornada experimental range. And recently we've wrapped up a project in Indonesia where we've been working on some of the tropical forests over there. Okay? But although we work in these sort of contrasting environments, we often ask the same question in 2 different ecosystems. And we often use the same hardware, the same analytical approaches. So it actually makes for quite an efficient operation working across that. Oftentimes we involve our cyber science as well. So this is anything ranging from new sensors or getting complicated sensors up and running, developing software, modifying things so that it works in the environment in which we're working, and things like that as well. And of course, all of this is sort of coupled to some pretty cool education and outreach. And as far as we're concerned, our research and our education are inextricably linked. So the success of one bears the success of another. We've had a good couple of years. I've had just over 50 pubs since 2011. Majority of those pubs have had student first authorship, which is something I really insist on in the lab. Bruce wanted me to include some of the citation indices information and whatnot there. But I'll just say that a lot of this actually ignores a lot of the computer science publications that we've put out. So I'm not sure if you interpret that as should be higher or not, but anyway, that's a little pet peeve of mine working across different disciplines. I'm not going to ask you to look at all of these, but these are the grants that we've wrapped up in the last few years. Today I'll give you some insight into one of those particular projects. And also these are the active federal grants that we have at present. And again, today I'll touch on some activities that we've been doing with this particular grant. I'm sorry that we don't have enough time to sort of take in kind of everything, but I'm trying to sew together a story that will lead into sort of trying to get at some of the future directions that we're headed to within the lab. Now, within the lab we work very much, oftentimes we work across disciplines. So that's only where it's appropriate. Sometimes we just do a project that stays within one discipline. But other times, as we do that type of science, we figure out, you know what, there has to be a better way of doing this. Gosh, I wish there was a new technology. If we only had a piece of software that could process our data this particular way. And what we do then is we spin that project or a subset of that project off into an interdisciplinary environment where we come together with students from computational science, electrical engineering, that type of thing, and we figure out solutions. Sometimes those solutions requires student groups working together in an interdisciplinary environment. Other times it requires handing off that particular problem into the engineering world and then working on the solutions that they provide back into the science. So we've been quite successful with developing this model, particularly through our involvement in the CyberShare Centre. And you can sort of see the different types of products that come out of this sort of working model. But for our environmental science, we use a whole variety of different approaches. Now today we'll only touch on a few of those. Those ones are in colour. The ones that are in grey are associated with projects that we won't cover today. But a lot of our work in the lab is kind of focused on how ecosystems, how is the environment responding to global change, which also includes climate change. So what we're talking about here is essentially looking at the sort of altered state of the Earth system. And fundamentally, big picture kind of science here is that we've transitioned from sort of what one would argue is a natural greenhouse state into a human enhanced greenhouse state. And this is because we've changed we've changed these greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere at very, very small concentrations, but we've obviously dramatically altered those concentrations, even though they make a very, very small part of the atmosphere. And the effect that that's having on the planet is obviously quite dramatic. So when we think about some of our students that are in classes today, you've got to know that by the time that they reach the peak of their careers, they're likely to have seen more climate change, more climate variability than what society has observed in the last 10,000 years. So the changes, the challenges that are will be confronted by the next generation are really quite significant as the Earth enters this new state. And those models predict into the future that it's the Arctic that will really bear some of the greatest changes due to climate change on Earth. So with that, I'll switch over and start talking a bit about our Arctic research. And when we think about climate change in the Arctic, oftentimes people immediately think of this headline news of the loss of sea ice, okay? And that has been absolutely amazing. So over the last few decades, we see the loss of this massive chunk of the Arctic ice cap. So not only have we seen a loss of area, we've also seen a reduction in thickness, okay? And that has it's not an impact that just sort of stays in the marine environment. This is an impact that translates onto the surrounding Arctic landscape. So in 2010, we joined up with a pretty diverse group of people, and we looked at where sea ice was changing in the Arctic. And then we used satellite data to look at how terrestrial landscapes were warming in the Arctic. And lo and behold, we basically found that wherever sea ice loss was greatest, through the northern sort of Beringian coast and through the Canadian high Arctic, was also where we saw the most dramatic warming in terrestrial landscapes. And then when we looked at sort of the greenness of vegetation, it's a measure of how productive a landscape is, we then saw a correlation, for the most part, between where you've got high rates of warming on land that corresponds to high rates of sea ice loss. This corresponds to areas in terrestrial landscapes that have also changed. Okay? So this system, we're seeing these land-ocean atmosphere connections here at very, very large spatial scales, but all of these measurements are derived from satellites. And the challenge here is trying to figure out what is it on the ground that has changed that is making these satellites basically suggest that something is going on. Okay? We need to decipher these pretty colours that the satellites are giving us and really fundamentally say what is it on the ground? What are the mechanics of this change that we're observing on the ground? And this is a lot where we focus. And we focus on this for several reasons, but to me this is probably one of the most important things, is that the Arctic contains this huge pool of soil organic carbon. It's absolutely massive. And it's contained in a very, very small area of the land surface on Earth in the Arctic that has a terrestrial sort of biosphere that is not very productive. Okay? You don't think of the Arctic as being this amazingly productive environment. For the most part, it functions more or less like if you have lawn in your backyard, it's going to function like your lawn in your backyard in El Paso. That's about as productive as most Arctic landscapes actually get. Okay? So we're looking at very, very low amounts of carbon within the biomass in most tundra ecosystems, and we're looking at very, very low rates of production. Okay? So this is sort of amount of carbon that's sucked up from the atmosphere every year and thrown into biomass. Okay? And so when you sort of add all this together, you soon realise that this soil organic carbon pool didn't form overnight. This took tens of thousands of years to become such a massive pool. Now, this pool of carbon exists mostly in permafrost, in a frozen state. So it's like vegetables in your refrigerator, okay, in your freezer. And everyone knows if the power goes out or you leave a bag of broccoli in the back of your fridge, what happens after a few weeks' time, right? It turns to mush. Well, that's the big concern here, is that we start defrosting, thawing out this carbon, making it available to microbes, and then that carbon that's in that sort of greenhouse inert state has the capacity to escape to the atmosphere and enhance greenhouse warming. Okay? And so that's what we're really worried about. Now, if we start to lose this carbon in the Arctic, we're obviously not going to get it back anytime soon, because the Arctic is this incredibly unproductive place. So what it means for the Earth system is that we have to look at what's happening in our tropical rainforests, what's happening in our tropical grasslands, as a way to potentially compensate for that into the future. So what happens in the Arctic has massive implications for how we manage and examine landscapes elsewhere in the world. So on the ground, this is kind of what it looks like, right? So this looks like your backyard in El Paso, right? Pretty miserable, okay? And then, so this is a piece of the Arctic coastline that we've been monitoring for coastal erosion. I'll show you some really cool pictures that we've got from there later. But let's just put this into perspective for a second. In the atmosphere, we have about 750 gigatons of carbon, plus or minus a few grams, right? Now, in Arctic soils, we're still trying to figure out how much is there. Okay, it's a very remote area. It's quite variable. People are still trying to sort of model how much carbon is there. But even if you kind of take a ballpark sort of number in the middle of this range, you soon realise we've got something close to the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere is locked in permafrost soils in the Arctic. So when you consider the damage that's been done, the sort of trajectory we're looking at for climate change, is all because of humans emitting about 5.5 gigatons of carbon per year to the atmosphere. You soon realise that even a very, very small loss of this massive soil organic carbon pool could quite dramatically enhance greenhouse warming. Okay? And so this is what it looks like. Every year we have about a half a metre of the top soil sort of thaws out, and so this sort of becomes very muddy, mushy. It's usually pretty waterlogged and that sort of thing. But below that, this is all totally frozen soil, okay? So this is a big ice wedge here. It's a really common feature in this particular landscape. So this particular landscape is ice-rich permafrost. So not only, when this warms and thaws, not only will we see loss of carbon, we'll also see subsidence, okay? So this is all just water. So when that obviously goes above 0 degrees Celsius, it just floods out into the oceans, okay? So this landscape that for 100 kilometres or more inland, that's only probably 60 feet above sea level, is very much prone to this subsidence and sort of dropping in altitude, and then obviously being impacted by things like sea level change as well. So it's a really fascinating environment. It's a great place to work and be an environmental scientist. So what we do in the lab is we kind of try and imagine this whole picture together. So we imagine how that soil carbon got there through photosynthetic uptake. And we look at how that carbon is deposited in the soils. If it's under aerobic conditions, we know that primarily it's CO2 that will be being released to the atmosphere through respiration. But if it's under anaerobic conditions, if it's waterlogged soils, we'll see a greater percentage or loss of methane gas, which in the atmosphere, even though it's only one carbon molecule, is a much more powerful greenhouse gas. Okay? We also look at the sort of reflective properties of the terrestrial landscapes and the ability of that landscape to basically reflect the radiation from the sun back into space rather than absorbing it in the terrestrial ecosphere. Okay? But obviously what we're talking about here is chemicals that, as they transition across this inert greenhouse active state, can dramatically alter the greenhouse warming potential of the landscape. And then the changes that you see in the atmosphere will obviously feed back to that ecosystem, and we typically see under warming conditions increased uptake of CO2 through photosynthesis. But we also see increased losses through respiration and methane under anaerobic conditions. And we also see that species change in the landscape, and landscape patterns also change. And that alters the reflective properties of the Earth's surface. And obviously, when you sort of pull all this together, the feedbacks to the atmosphere are really quite amazing. So it's really the challenge here is understanding the system and the feedbacks. And moving forward, it's really a key to this is understanding what's happening with permafrost and how this system is all integrated and responding over change. So today what I'm going to do is talk about only 3 particular topics of many that we've looked at in recent years, and walk you through a land cover change study, a change in plant communities that we've observed, and also I'm going to throw in a pretty neat study that we looked at herbivory. And this was something that, it really challenged the way I think about this system. And what the story there is that lemmings, these tiny little rodents, have the capacity to completely alter this landscape, completely alter the land-atmosphere transfer of carbon, water and energy. And so it reminds you, sometimes you have to look at these very small, the way these small things function to understand how they manifest to these large spatial scales. So let's go back and think about this diagram here that I talked to you about. And what we noticed here, when we looked at sea ice loss, we saw warming of terrestrial landscapes. Where we saw warming of terrestrial landscapes, for the most part, we saw greening of terrestrial landscapes. But there was one area where that just didn't hold up, and that was in the Beringia area. Okay? So we had similar rates of sea ice loss, similar rates of warming, but in the Russian Arctic, we saw a browning of Arctic landscapes, whereas we saw a greening in northern Alaskan landscapes. And so, why is that? Okay, it might only be a fairly small area in the Arctic, but if we don't understand these dynamics, then I think we have to say that we're not quite sure that we really understand how this system is working and what do we really believe when we look at this satellite imagery. At the moment, it just doesn't make sense. This is something that's bugged me for many, many years. And so to do this study, we drew on many years of field work that dates back to 2005. And this is a period where we operated throughout the Chukotkin Arctic, as well as the Seward Peninsula, and also the North Slope of Alaska. Okay, so any of you that are TV geeks, the deadliest catch, you know, the story about natural selection on water kind of thing, that's all taking place all around this particular area. So we're well and truly north of this landscape. And the study was aided by this really cool opportunity that we got to work with the State Department, the National Geospatial Agency, and NSF to release large volumes of this former military spy imagery. Okay? So the spy imagery that we got hold of is comparable to these modern high-resolution satellite imagery that we commonly work with today. But the cool thing here is that this imagery, for some reason, has wonderful coverage of Russia, but it dates back to 1963, and so it allows you to do this really phenomenal intercomparison. So here we see these sort of shrub thickets here that have clearly expanded since the early 1960s, and we're able to do that at all of these sites across this massive region that is really difficult to operate in. It's really challenging to get permits. It's really challenging to get in there. It's even harder to get out of there. And you never pay the helicopter pilot up front, I can tell you that. And we had a wonderful student work on this project, David Lynn, and he figured out how to take these two images, turn the modern imagery into grayscale imagery like the historic satellite imagery, and then do image classification on that. Okay, that was a really tricky thing to do. And he was able to test it, and this is a sort of animation showing change from 1948 to 2008. So we did throw in, where we could, we also threw in some aerial photography here. But this is a large-scale experimental flooding and draining experiment that we did sort of 2005 to 2010 or so. And so it was a great training area for him to look at how, whether or not his classification was making sense. And it really was. He was able to prove it here, and that got a couple of really nice papers through the system. Now what Dave did then is that he went and he took all of this field data that he collected across all of these different sites, and that we used very much a standardized approach to the way we measured all of these measurements at all of these different sites that we went to. And so he was able to parameterize these pretty neat sort of regression models where he could eventually found he only needed a relatively few measurements to gain a really good model that predicted both ecosystem exchange of CO2 and ecosystem exchange of methane as well. And so because the model was parameterized for different land cover types, and Dave had figured out how to map land cover change over time, he was then able to take these models and then run them on these land cover models that illustrated how that ecosystem would function in different points in time if we just assumed the same environmental conditions prevailed. Okay? And what he found was really interesting. We thought this would be kind of fairly simple. We really didn't have an appreciation for the complexities, and it took us a long time to kind of figure out how to visualize this, how to explain this. But essentially, what he found was that the greatest change was in the lower latitudes, okay, in the Chukotkin Peninsula, the Seward Peninsula in particular, and inland on the North Slope of Alaska. And he saw relatively little change on the Arctic coastal plain. And if you remember this figure here, one thing I forgot to point out is that we saw on this, when we did this study, we saw the most change within 50 kilometres of the Arctic coastline, suggesting that was the most dynamic landscape that satellites detect as showing change. But that's not what Dave saw when he ran his models. So what he actually saw here was generally a wetting of the landscape in Chukotka, whereas the Alaskan side was actually drying, okay, which was kind of a little bit weird, and we still haven't figured this one out. We've got a hypothesis that we're working on some NASA proposals and a pretty kind of maybe a high-profile sort of hypothesis of what's going on with this. But the jury is still out. We're still trying to figure out what's going on here. But he definitely detected a transition towards more wetter landscapes in Chukotka, drier landscapes through the Arctic. And when he looked at the change in global warming potential, so this is essentially the capacity, after we model the interchange between land and atmosphere, what is the sort of global warming potential of that interchange? And generally he found kind of mixed responses, okay? So it was a mixed response in Chukotka, and as there was really no overall consistent response in Alaska. And at the time when we did the study, it really wasn't clear to us what the significance of this really was. He also looked at whether or not the change in this greenness value that we recorded from satellites actually matched what we observed on the ground. Now, for the lower latitudes, it really did. Okay? We saw a good match between the sort of change we saw from satellite and the sort of change that we observed on the ground. But up in the coastal plain, where the satellites basically say things are changing the most, it doesn't add up to what we're actually seeing on the ground. So after this sort of study, we'd pretty much exhausted this type of an approach. And so the next sort of phase of investigation, what we decided to do was sort of go down in spatial scale and look at plant community change. Now, so what I'm going to do is talk to you about the Back to the Future project, which is, I didn't realize till just walking down the stairwell now, and Hazuri mentioned it to me, but the movie, I guess, predicted today as being the future of the Back to the Future movie, right? So I really should be standing on a hoverboard, and if I wore shoes with shoelaces, they would tie themselves and do all things like that. But no, you're going to have to deal with some boring science. But we had this project. It was funded as part of the International Polar Year program. It allows us to go back and rescue and resample a lot of these historic sites throughout the Arctic. And today I'll talk about two of those particular sites. One up in sort of our kind of home base in Barrow in northern Alaska, and another in a very, very remote area. It's probably some of the most remote field work I've ever done in my life, and that was going back to Baffin Island. And this was made possible because of my postdoc mentor, Patrick Webber, who was absolutely amazing influence on my career and just the way I think. I think about the lessons he taught me every single day. But anyway, Pat did his PhD in the early 1960s in the middle of Baffin Island. And where he did that was over 300 miles from the nearest settlement. And it's almost harder to get there now than it used to be, simply because we don't have the aircraft, we don't have the sort of cowboy pilots that we used to do, and that sort of thing. So it was a very, very difficult place to get back to. It took several years of planning. But the scientific gain from going and doing that work has been just tremendous. And what Pat did is all of his sites, he established these 1 by 10 metre sites. And numerous sites, on Baffin Island, for example, he established 80 of these for his PhD. And what we basically did was we repeated the sampling that Pat did when he first initialized these sites. And then what we also did is we went back there and not only worked with the plant cover and abundance data that Pat worked with and documented early on, we went back and we documented things like ecosystem carbon and methane flux. We recorded hyperspectral reflectance, albedo, soil moisture, and a whole bunch of other things as well. Okay, so we used the traditional methods, but also the modern methods. Okay, and that the challenge was sort of combining those together. Now, when we looked at the Barrow data, and remember, this is an area where the satellites say there's tremendous change. Our previous landscape level measurements said there's a little bit of change, but really not that much, okay, relative to other areas of the Arctic. And lo and behold, this is a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination of species importance data here, and it's a whole bunch of dots and that sort of thing, the different colours represent different vegetation types, and the different symbols represent different resampling periods, okay? And so what I've done here is just circle this grey land cover type, which happens to be an aquatic vegetation, and then translated that in these slides here to show you the sort of change over time that we're talking about, okay? And the results that we got here really matched the landscape scale measurements that we also observed, okay? So not a whole lot of changes really going on here, but it was the wet vegetation like this where we saw the most change. We also happened to do one resampling in 2008 at a period when there was a lemming outbreak, okay? So we were kind of bummed at the time because we thought we knew we'd have to come back and redo the sampling where we thought we would only have to do it once. But in the long run, that exercise of sampling during a lemming high and then a few years later has been absolutely invaluable to the directions that we're going in the lab right now. Now, coupled to Sandra's measurements, as I said, Mark Lara came in and he made all sorts of different measurements about how that ecosystem functions. So CO2 exchange, methane exchange, all sorts of things like that, right? Now, the point is that what Mark was able to do was using Sandra's ordination of site values within ordination space, he was able to use a geostatistical approach that then overlaid his measurements of CO2 or methane flux and that sort of thing on that in ordination space, and then create like a Krigged map that it basically basically maps out how that ecosystem would, say, function, for example, in this case for methane exchange. And so from that sort of landscape of functional values, Mark was then able to extract the locations of the ordination, or the plots on that functional space, and then translate those dots from the map onto a timeline. And so using that, he was able to sort of project how, for example, net ecosystem exchange might have changed over time, okay? So he did that for all the different vegetation types, all the different measurements that he made. And so these are all listed here, but really the take-home message here is, again, we didn't see a whole lot of change. Where we did see a lot of change was in NDVI, where we saw a large drop in wet vegetation, and we saw for net ecosystem exchange and global warming potential, we saw, in case of net ecosystem exchange, we saw the wet vegetation types become more productive over time, okay? But the interesting thing here, as you can see, these last two dots are the sampling in 2008 and 2010. And there's quite a lot of variability oftentimes in that, just in those two sample years relative to the change observed over the whole time period. And that's all related to this little guy, which you can hold if he doesn't bite you, in the palm of your hand. And these things literally, you'll go for years not even seeing one, to going out one day during a lemming high, and you probably will step on like literally dozens during the day as they try and scurry away from you under your feet. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to watch these guys outbreak. Now, so and this is sort of the precursor to another story that I'll tell you here in a second about the herbivory study that we did. Now, on Baffin Island, we saw something quite different. This is a very, very different landscape. It's located near the Barnes ice cap, which is the largest ice cap in the Arctic aside from the Greenland ice cap, and it's melting very quickly. So this is an animation showing how this landscape has changed from 1963 to 2009. These photographs were taken within a few calendar days of the year apart from one another, okay? So we'll look at that again. So look at the loss of all this surface water, and a lot of that is because we've lost all of these snowbanks that would melt out during the growing season. So that's no longer present, okay? And what we're able to do at this particular landscape is visit some sites that Pat established in the 1960s. And we went back and remeasured the widths of crustose lichen growing on those rocks. And those growth rates indicate time since colonisation. So because we had two measurements in time, we're able to use lichenometric methods to basically date the deglaciation history of this particular landscape over a very, very large spatial area. And then we also did the traditional ordination, the same thing as I showed you the last time. And basically we saw quite a lot more change at this site than we did in Barrow. The site that changed the most was sites that Pat established on landscapes that were very recently deglaciated. Okay, and that's what you should expect. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a plant community that's showing strong responses to succession following deglaciation. So what Sandra did is that she took these trajectories of change over here and plotted them as vector lengths and saw that there were successional sites that were changing the most, followed by some of the sites that really rely on the sort of the flow of water into the landscape units that they work in. So when she ran some regression trees on that, it gave us sort of the sort of environmental parameters that are most likely associated with that type of change. So in the dry landscapes, we saw very, very little change over time. Some of the snowbed communities, we saw a large amount of change. There's a person there's Sandra sitting on that same rock in 2009. But where we saw the greatest change was in these wetland landscapes. And for example, the species of graminoid that makes up a lot of these pond margins now wasn't even found in this region in the 1960s. Okay, so it's moved sort of upriver and further north by at least 50 to 100 kilometres over the past few decades. And what she also did is that she did some regression tree change point analyses to look at how these patterns of succession has changed over time. And what we think we found here is evidence, probably the first evidence in the Arctic, that basically identifies that succession is occurring in the Arctic, in these deglaciating landscapes, much quicker than it ever used to. Okay? So we're seeing high rates of species diversity, higher rates of plant cover in a shorter amount of time following deglaciation. Okay? So, and that's important because we're losing the Greenland ice cap, we're losing the Barnes ice cap, and many, many other glaciated landscapes across the Arctic. So that's one negative feedback to climate change that appears to be happening. Now going back to Barrow, this is an area famous for its history and studying lemmings and that sort of thing. And as we've been working on these historic sites and whatnot, we wandered past these things for years until we finally realised what they were. These are grazing exclosures established in the 1950s. There's about 70 of them. And after we sort of threw an undergrad in there, left them there for a few days looking for poop, we realised there was about 30 of these exclosures that had no signs of grazing. So after all these years, they remain intact. And what we think these are is the oldest herbivory exclosures in the Arctic. And so what we've done is gone back and resampled those sites for vegetation, species cover and abundance. And the plots were established in dry, moist and wet land cover types. And obviously we saw quite dramatic changes. In dry sites we saw this massive growth of lichen in response to release from grazing pressure. In the moist, we saw that in the moist site as well. In the wet site we saw this massive accumulation of leaf litter. Okay, and that's going to become really important to the story here in the next few slides. And in the moist site we basically saw the complete, I guess, loss of bare ground over time as well. So these are really, really dramatic changes in the structure of these particular ecosystems. So again, the question is, does this structural change in the way an ecosystem presents itself also translate to a change in the way it functions? And the answer is not necessarily. Okay, so when Mark went in and did his thing, all of these different parameters that he looked at, it was really only the wet sites where he continuously found significant change in all of the things that he was measuring. So what does that look like? Well, it basically, in the grey site, so this is sort of under the conditions as we know it today, we see a lot of solar radiation coming into these sites, not a lot coming out. So there's a lot of heat energy from the sun being absorbed. We see a deep active layer, deep layer to permafrost, and we see fairly high rates of loss of methane and CO2 to the atmosphere. But we see this massive uptake of CO2 into the system through photosynthesis. And we basically see the opposite to that in the ungrazed site. So there's basically just hardly any green biomass in this site relative to this site. Okay? Now, what that means when we then the question became, well, so what? You know, what? Let's just take for a moment and just sort of figure out how important might these lemmings really be to the way the whole landscape is actually functioning. So what Mark did is that he used this wonderful land cover classification that Christian Andreessen had come up with. And he basically modelled how that ecosystem, based on land cover type, would look in the, oh, I forgot to label this, in the presence of lemmings, okay, in this line of plots, versus the absence of lemmings, okay? And what we basically see is that we see this heat energy from the sun being absorbed when lemmings are present. We see very, very high rates of ecosystem productivity when lemmings are present. We also see high rates of loss to the atmosphere as methane. But when we combine CO2 and methane together into an index that gives us some measure of global warming potential, what we basically see is that this landscape could not be the historical carbon sink that we know it as without lemmings being present in this particular landscape. So without these periodic outbreaks or these population eruptions of these tiny little lemmings, this ecosystem would not have accumulated this tremendous amount of carbon that we know it over time. That's what we think anyway. Okay? So there's several ongoing projects that we have working right now. One is a long-term project that Sergio is currently writing up right now. So the short-term products of that particular project, there's been a lot of sort of innovations in technology. And one of the really things I'm absolutely amazed with how he's done this, but he's been able to, with about $1,000 worth of hardware and dangling a camera off the bottom of a kite, then using structure for motion algorithms for processing, he's able to generate and build maps, very, very fine-scaled microtopographic maps of this landscape that typically people need probably $80,000 to $100,000 worth of equipment to make those same measurements these days. Okay, so this is a huge breakthrough on that. He's also beginning to work on looking at sort of what controls this sort of phenological variability, or the growth and the differences in growth and reproduction through the season and between landscape types. And again, we're seeing this wet landscapes showing up again as one of our most dynamic land cover units that we're working in. Another project that we're working in, this has been a large and concerted effort. There's a lot of moving parts to this particular project. But what we're looking at here is very large-scale wetlands mapping. So with our survey area is something like 40 miles by about 20 miles here. We're running up and down the coast in our boat, making bathymetry maps. We're doing all sorts of high-precision surveys along the coastline, waterline, and then looking at the eroding coastal bluffs. And this last summer, we ran a preliminary project working with Vanessa that looks at sort of what's this sort of biogeochemical transfer from the terrestrial landscapes into the marine environment. What we basically see here is extremely exciting. This is probably the largest survey of PCO2 ever done in Arctic nearshore waters. But what we see, the largest sort of drainage watershed in the Barrow area as it drains to the ocean is transporting this massive amount of CO2-rich water to nearshore waters. So that's obviously changing. It's not only sort of fertilising the nearshore environment, it's also changing the acidity of nearshore coastal waters and all sorts of other really cool things going on. So that project is very much sort of in the phase of trying to pull together all of these different moving parts into telling a story right now. But we have several grants pending right now, again, to continue these long-term observations. We'll submit an education grant here in a week and a half. Vanessa's taking the lead on that, and Jeff Olimpo has joined the team on that one for an undergraduate education project. There's all sorts of other things that we'd like to get at in the next few years. We're still not satisfied with how we can explain this satellite greening trend, but there's a new NASA program that's being initiated that will provide access to aircraft data and other ground resources that will be needed to basically take things to the next step and figure that question out. It's a big one. In our drylands research, again, we've had good success recently with some large funding from USDA and NSF. Hope to continue that in a variety of different fronts. And the same thing for our cyber science project there. The exciting news is that we've got a provisional patent on a new camera system and software configuration and analysis package that goes with these cameras. So we're hoping to put in an NSF I-Corps grant early next year that will allow us to kind of look at how to build a licensing or business plan for potentially marketing these sorts of technologies to a broader audience. So Bruce asked me to include a couple of slides on teaching and service. So just this lists the classes that I've just absolutely loved teaching and being involved with. And just I guess I want to reinforce that, you know, for our lab, the way that we function, we can't separate the research from teaching. The two go hand in hand together, particularly working across the interdisciplinary lines that we actually do. And so I foresee probably the nearest sort of short-term career challenges for me is potentially taking on the directorship of the environmental science and engineering program. So it needs a lot of fixing, but I think it's a real diamond in the rough, that particular program. Okay, and then service. Over time, I've really appreciated doing more service. It's just amazing the people that you end up meeting on these committees. Been privileged to work at some pretty high-profile national and international committees recently, particularly working with the review of the International Arctic Science Committee, which is the lead science advisor to the Arctic Council, which actually has just transferred to the United States. And then also doing sort of VIP tours more and more in the places that we work. So this year we had the pleasure of showing probably the highest profile contingent from NSF, including Franz Cordova, the director of NSF, who visited our sites up in Barrow this summer. So with that, I'd like to say thanks. It's been a great few years. I really appreciate, again, the efforts that the lab puts into working as a team and coming up with the projects and products that they do. And also our collaborators and also our administrative staff. You know, doing the kind of work that we do in the places where we work is not easy, and especially not with some of the recent challenges we've had with the business system and whatnot. So it's incredible. I almost feel like, you know, they should be co-authors on our paper, the amount of effort and sort of they go to. But our funding sources, a lot of our research is performed on native-owned lands, and so we do have a strong involvement of native peoples in the work that we do. And of course, friends and family goes without saying, especially to Vanessa for putting up with one toddler that was going through potty training, another toddler that was learning to walk in the last year after multiple surgeries. That was a huge amount of pressure on her, and I really do appreciate her. And I'd say that a lot of the photography that you've seen today was because we were lucky enough this summer to have Florencia join us for this summer in Alaska. She had her own fundraiser program, and that basically supported her involvement in the field crew for 3 months this summer in Alaska. So I'll leave you with a pretty neat slideshow of some of the pictures that she took this summer, and I'll entertain any questions that you might have, okay? Thanks.
Great presentation.
Thanks, man.
And so I have a question about, so all these changes that some people looking at microbial environment is changing with the times, that people looking at how, different types, quantitative and qualitative change in microbial, bacteria, fungi.
Yeah, we're not. I'd say anything below ground is one of my absolute weaknesses. But in the Barrow area, there's a large $100 million Department of Energy program going on, and within that, they're doing a lot of soil microbial work, stuff that's I've never sort of heard of being done in the Arctic before. The other hotspot for soil microbial work is Toolik Lake, where Anthony and Jenny have spent many, many years. But I would say not nearly enough is being done, and I really regard that as a bit of a frontier, especially if we could get sort of proteomics involved and other things like that. I mean, that to me is just so exciting to see that happen, and having the capacities here at UTEP to do that now, and the right people to do that, that's extremely exciting. I foresee really great things happening there. Yeah. Eli.
Craig, can you just touch on the natural history of the lemmings and why there are these fluctuations in the populations over time?
Yeah, I've got to be careful there because it's ruined several people's careers. Saying that, it's funny. If you go back in the literature, you'll find these guys that, one will say it's cycling, the other ones say that it's not, and there's in Barrow anyway. There's evidence of people falsifying results to basically stick with a belief rather than sticking with the science and things like that. So it's a bit of a dirty field. So we're obviously not wildlife people at all. But what I think is a really interesting thing going on in Barrow right now is, if you look back in history, the last outbreak for lemmings was 2008. And that's the longest time since the 1940s that there's been since a lemming outbreak. And so previous to that, it's been anywhere from 3 to maybe 6 years. Okay, is sort of the range on that previously. So we're already kind of in new ground. But what's happened over the last decade in Barrow, and this summer was extraordinary for me, is the goose populations have exploded, absolutely exploded. So you've got people that monitor, different species are doing different things. But for example, the white-fronted snow geese is white-breasted snow geese. A colleague of mine studying those, he started studying them 10 years ago. There was 100 breeding pairs. This summer they estimated over 12,000 breeding pairs. Okay, and that's one species actually very, very isolated in one area. There's more generic species that are spread over broad areas. So I was just saying to Jenny, I think the other day, is that what I think's happened in Barrow is because of the overwintering grounds of these geese are now soy and cornfields and stuff like that, right? They're coming, the overwintering survivorship is a lot higher when geese are arriving in the Arctic. And basically they're hitting the Arctic that may be, in the areas that they kind of breed, are maybe more productive than they used to be as well. There's certainly warmer conditions, so summer survivorship is probably higher than it used to be. And so a bunch of factors probably have led together this population explosion. And what that means for lemmings is that I think the system is shifting from this sort of once every 5 years sort of eruptive population explosion where lemmings basically eat everything in sight, then they just die off and everything regrows over the next sort of 5 years to the next outbreak. Whereas now we're dealing with sort of a herbivore that basically mows everything down every summer, right, and then disappears. And when the lemmings, there's still some around, they can't, they're not getting through the winter as well as they used to, because the foliage is not there to build the tunnels to insulate themselves from them and their young from within the subnivean space and stuff, right? So considering how important lemmings are, what we think anyway, to overall carbon balance, I'm kind of questioning whether the system is in kind of a tipping point right now, So we're talking amongst a few colleagues, wildlife, snowy owl guys, that sort of thing. So next summer we'll try and sort of coordinate just tweaking our existing sampling programs in a few different ways to sort of do a better job at documenting geese and their impacts and stuff like that. And so I think that would position us quite well for a pretty high-profile paper questioning whether this coastal landscape is at this tipping point, So it's really important to the way the system works and subsistence, hunting, all that sort of stuff as well, So,
Time for about one more question?
thanks, Cole.
So, do you see any other rodents other than lemmings in that bucket area?
No, the two big ones there, we've got the brown lemming is by far the most numerous. We've also got this collared lemming, which is kind of really, it's a much more pretty lemming and much more well-behaved when you pick it up and throw it down someone's shirt, But that's really it. As you go further south into the drier, the sort of tussock tundra and stuff like that, you'll start to see voles and becoming a lot more important. Yeah, but up on the coastal plain here, I would say voles are not so important. The other herbivores that we've got, of course, other than waterfowl, are caribou. At the moment, caribou populations are down. So the western caribou herd went from about 400,000 animals. I think they're down in sort of high 200,000s right now. So they've undergone a bit of a crash themselves. And then occasionally we'll get a muskox that comes through. But generally the rangifers and the muskox are certainly not a huge impact on this landscape. Yeah.
So I was curious with all the technology that you guys in Saco and Harvey created.
Yeah.
So the satellite data showed in particular areas that had the most change, but yet your actual sampling data
Yep.
showed there was actually very little change. So is there a
Yeah.
way to now reprogram the satellites to actually look at something that's more relevant?
Yeah. So we've got a pretty high level review being drafted right now that kind of, again, it hypothesizes what's going on. So I didn't want to present it today because of that. But what we think is happening is there's been a massive oversight in how we've interpreted the satellite data. Okay, and this has happened before. It happened in the Amazon, right, where there was for years you had science papers coming out one after the other. Oh, the Amazon's drying. It's browning. It's showing signs of it's going to turn into a desert. This is real sort of dramatic sort of things. But it turns out that there's some pretty basic things that, for someone in my shoes on the ground, that were not being accounted for by the guys that sit behind the desk doing all the really fancy remote sensing. And I think the same things happened in the Arctic. Now, basically, I'll just real quick, the quickest way to explain this is, and really a paper by Vanessa and Christian nailed this, is that they documented a loss of something like 30% of the ponds in this particular landscape. So the landscape's drying, right? So when you take a spectrometer and you put it over a patch of tundra that's got standing water in it, right? And then you pump that water out. The signal, when you duplicate it for what the satellites are seeing, will basically indicate that landscape is becoming greener. And because the way that the algorithms that they use to essentially decide greenness relies on the infrared. And water absorbs infrared light. And so when you take water away and then you add infrared reflectance, then you raise the interpretation of greenness. And so what we think is happening, at least for the coastal rim of the Arctic, is that the landscape is not greening. It's becoming drier. So we're seeing loss of water bodies, and some would argue that's higher impact than a change in the actual greening. Do you know what I mean? So that's,
It's a really neat example of showing how
yeah,
you have to always have this
Yeah.
feedback between actual basic
Yeah.
research.
absolutely. And it's fringe science. It's
Yeah.
incredibly exciting, you know.
Well, I'm afraid
Yeah.
in the interest of time, we need to
Yep.
curtail any more questions. So if you have more,